this on? It's on, okay. Welcome to the SCI-Arc lecture series. And Neil Denari is going to introduce Peter Wollen, who's speaking tonight. And here they are.
Peter Wollen is tonight's speaker, and he is, I think, here at a good time and will, I think, expand SCI-Arc's usual seemingly wide boundaries a little bit further in talking about images and the theory of images and their production, in particular tonight about Andy Warhol, and his talk is called The Leftovers of Show Business. Peter teaches currently at UCLA. He's been there a year or so and after coming from London. He teaches in the cinema and TV department there, but is probably more well known for his films and books. He's written 2 books, one called Signs of Meaning in Cinema, and the second called Readings and Writing. And he's working on a third currently about 20th century art. He's also a filmmaker and has made a number of films. The latest was called Friendship's Death, and not incidentally or coincidentally, he co-wrote The Passenger, which is a film by Antonioni, which is quite a brilliant film. Lately, he's also curated some exhibitions, most recently 2. The first by artists Frida Kahlo and Tina Modotti, artists working together, and currently an exhibition which is now in Boston, which opened in Paris and went to London, which is an exhibition about the Situationists who were working in the late 50s through the early 70s, a work of that group as well as people that they influenced. Please welcome Peter Wollen.
I'm not going to be talking about architecture at all, and I don't have any slides, whatever. I'll just say that by way of introduction. I'm going to talk about Andy Warhol. And the starting point of what I want to say is to relate Warhol to what has been called Fordism, i.e. American-style, assembly line, rationalized mass production of the kind pioneered by Henry Ford, which gave the United States its economic advantage in the 20th century. Fordist mass production inevitably demanded mass marketing and mass consumption as its corollary. Thus, the long post-war American boom saw the development of a massive merchandising machine in the advertising, packaging, and media industries. This great leap forward of marketing and publicity was predicated, of course, on a great leap forward in the production of images, in the streets, in the press, on television. The seismic change in the form of mass culture, as it both proliferated and was subordinated to the drive of mass production and mass consumption, was finally reflected in the narrower and traditionally purer spheres of the arts and high culture, unable to delay or resist confrontation with the new visual environment or the economic weight and pressure of the new communications industries. In this sense, the arrival of pop art in the early 60s was just one element in a much more general cultural shift. Warhol and Lichtenstein should be seen alongside cultural critics such as McLuhan or Eco or Barth, writers like Burroughs, obsessed by advertising, the image bank, the word virus, and the reality studios, and of course filmmakers like Jean-Luc Godard, and I guess architectural writers like the Venturis learning to love Las Vegas. Artists had to come to terms with the new images, whether through irony, celebration, aesthetic enhancement, or détournement. But if Warhol stands out among them as anything more than a harbinger of this new parasitism of art on the media, it's because his work has a more complex meaning. Like his great contemporary Joseph Beuys, Warhol, another master of disguise, was able to shift the optical and semiotic field of art towards a new and potentially troubling theatricality. This in turn left an important political as well as aesthetic legacy. In the case of Beuys, to be found in the Green Party, and in the case of Warhol in the gay liberation movement. Warhol's key achievement within the field of pop was to bring together the apparent contraries of minimalism and camp in a paradoxical and perverse new combination. The minimalist current into which Warhol tapped began or re-began with John Cage, after Gertrude Stein, after Satie. Cage, in revolt against the authoritarian systematicity of his teacher Schoenberg here in Los Angeles, invented a form of music which rejected the traditional ideology of composition with its pillars of harmony, structure, order, and control. This in turn led him to abandon the whole idea of the artist as organizational source and master of the work. Indeed, Cage developed a philosophy which equalized all the parts of a work and stressed duration, repetition, and random elements. Art should be brought back into relationship with everyday life. It should use found objects or found sounds and respect the uneven rhythms of day-by-day existence, even its banality, dead periods, and ordinariness. At the limit, Cage was fascinated by silence, which posited duration with a special intensity, while negating the traditional appeal of music as melody and even the unthought-through concept of audibility itself. Because, in a certain sense, audibility, silence was the most audible register of all. Silence, too, foregrounded the incidental and the not meant to be listened to, refocusing our perception of the acoustic environment, removing the oral frame which marked music off from everyday life. Like the artists of Cobra in Europe, Cage also placed everyday life in relationship to play, to non-purposive free activity. Thus, everyday life would be aestheticized as art was recontextualized as part of, rather than separated from, daily life. But for Cage, unlike the Cobra artists, with their surrealist background, this was primarily a spiritual rather than a political project. Cage's ideas and practices gradually spread out from the music world into the related dance world, especially through his collaboration with Merce Cunningham, and eventually into the art world through Black Mountain College, through Rauschenberg, and thence to Jasper Johns, and through the Fluxus group. It was through this radiation of Cage's aesthetic that minimalism came to Warhol, although Cage himself notes analogies between his own love for Satie's furniture music and Warhol's manufacture of Brillo and other boxes, which could be and actually were used as furniture, being treated as coffee tables. Rauschenberg and Johns were initially, of course, Warhol's role models in the art world. Like him, they designed window displays for Bonwit Teller's department store in New York, but unlike him, they were also recognized in the gallery world for their fine art. Like him too, they were gay artists who came from art-starved provincial backgrounds and who'd fled to New York to nurture their will to art. They offered an alternative avenue to those who, like Warhol, could hardly identify with the straight macho posturing of the abstract expressionists at the Cedar Tavern and the claims of abstract expressionism to seriousness and mastery. Rauschenberg knew Cage from 1951 when he collaborated with him on an automation piece in which Cage drove his Model A Ford along an inked section of roadway and then across 20 pasted together sheets of paper. He grew close to him in '52 when they both spent the summer at Black Mountain. Rauschenberg, meanwhile, had been working on minimal all-white and all-black paintings, analogous to Cage's work. But the important collaboration which took place was at the now legendary Event, a precursor of the multimedia happenings and performances of the 60s. Rauschenberg operated the record player for Cage, and films and slides were projected onto his white paintings, beneath which Cunningham danced, poems were read, and Cage's music played. The Black Mountain Event was the first of a series of artistic collaborations between Merce Cunningham and Rauschenberg, which persisted till the mid-60s. Rauschenberg worked on other dance performances too, designing sets and/or costumes, and in the early 60s he became closely involved in the work of the Judson Dance Theatre in New York, founded by dancers from Cunningham's company, deeply influenced by Cage. They were joined by other dancers who performed at the Judson Church, a space and refuge made available to artists in many fields and from different backgrounds, a catalyst for the arts, avant-garde, bohemian, and underground, whose activities had a deep and lasting impact on Warhol. In fact, it was because of Rauschenberg's involvement, Warhol said, that he first went to the Judson Church. It was there that he encountered the theatricalization of minimalism, and it was there too that he saw that theatricalization reach into the realm of glitter, extravaganza, and camp. Camp, of course, emerged as an art historical category with Susan Sontag's Notes on Camp, first published in Partisan Review in 1964. This was the year in which Warhol had his Flowers show and made his first sound films in The Factory, which Billy Linich had decorated all over with silver foil and silver spray paint a few months previously. Reading Sontag's essay today is like reading through a litany of Warhol's tastes, allusions, and affinities. It's all there: the Tiffany lamps, the National Enquirer headlines, the Bellini operas, the Furbank novels, the old comics, the bad movies, the idolization of Garbo, post-rock and roll pop music, corny flamboyant femaleness, dresses made of millions of feathers, and on a more theoretical level, the redemption of banality, the transcendence of the nausea of the replica, the volatile intermixing of sheer frivolity with passionate commitment, the taste for excess and extravagance, dandyism in the age of mass culture. Camp, of course, involved a rejection of the whole late modernist aesthetic, that citadel of high seriousness and good taste, as elaborated by Greenberg, who saw himself as defending the gates against the barbarians of kitsch massed without. In this sense, camp taste, with its exaggerated aestheticization, its playful connoisseurship of kitsch, was fated to play a decisive part in the demise of modernism. At the same time, it was pushing insistently towards performance, towards the theatricalization of everyday life. Warhol's own version of camp is visible everywhere in his early commercial artwork, where, however, the inclination to excess is prudently held in check. There are limits which often seem calculated in their containment. Gold leaf remains decorative, foot fetishism remains whimsical, boys and cherubs remain charmingly precious. It was not till the 1960s, till the factory days, that camp was let off the leash of good taste, no longer limited by a self-conscious censorship, to be evaded in private scrapbooks like the Foot Book and the Cock Book, but channeled within a rigorous and austere aesthetic. It was minimalism that enabled Warhol to release this orgy of camp. And it was at the Judson Church that this encounter of minimalism and camp crystallized for Warhol, to be transposed later into a new register. There, the discipline of minimalist dance met the flagrant masquerade of femininity. Warhol was, of course, already aware of the minimalist direction in which the art world was moving. He had acquired a set of small paintings by Frank Stella, and he must have also known the Stella black painting that his friend D'Antonio owned. Warhol was a dedicated gallery goer and also an art buyer. Moreover, he prided himself when he was a commercial artist on his facility, his ability to draw fast with only one line, And he had also always been interested in print media, in techniques of replication, such as the blotting technique he made his trademark, and the stamps, rubber stamps which he carved out of erasers. His long-standing interest, encouraged by commercial considerations, in doing as much work as possible as fast as possible, was bound to push him towards a minimalist reduction. But he was also interested in content and in performance, and here the example of dance was crucial. The exemplary minimalist dancer and choreographer at the Judson Church was Yvonne Rainer. Her first work at the Cunningham studio in '61, 3 Sati Spoons, had a repetitive structure based on Cage's work and performed to music by Satie. The next year, Warhol was at Judson to watch her ordinary dance, and in 1963, her Terrain, lit by Rauschenberg, which included a series of partly rule-governed activities, walking, jostling, passing, standing still, and a love duet in which she delivered hackneyed expressions, I love you, I don't love you, I never loved you, in a flat monotone which one critic likened to the recitation of a grocery order. In 1966, Yvonne Rainer wrote a retrospective manifesto for the dance work of the period, drawing parallels between sculptural and dance minimalism, a quasi-survey of some minimalist tendencies. In this, she likened the energy equality and found movement of dance to the factory fabrication of sculpture or objects, equality of parts and repetition in dance to modules in sculpture, repetition or discrete events in dance to uninterrupted surface in sculpture, neutral performance and task-like activity in dance to non-referential forms and literalness in sculpture. Though she was presumably thinking of other artists than Warhol, the parallelism holds good. Warhol's work is characterized precisely by factory fabrication, modular tendency, uninterrupted surface, and literalness. It holds good both for Warhol's gallery work, including the sculptural Brillo boxes, and also for his film work. Except that, crucially, Warhol's predilection for exhibitionistic routines replaced neutral performance, at least in the later films. Early work like Sleep or Eat, or indeed Empire, his architectural documentary, was often neutral. There's a sense, perhaps, in which we can think of Warhol's relationship to Rauschenberg as analogous to Yvonne Rainer's relationship to Merce Cunningham. Before she became involved with the founding and program of the Judson Dance Theatre, Yvonne Rainer had worked with the James Waring Company of Dancers. Later she recollected that Jimmy had an amazing gift, which because I was put off by the mixture of camp and balleticism in his work, I didn't appreciate until much later. His company was always full of misfits. They were too short or too fat or too uncoordinated or too mannered or too inexperienced by any other standards. He had this gift of choosing people who couldn't do too much in conventional technical terms, but who under his subtle directorial manipulations revealed spectacular stage personalities. Here a completely different parallel with Warhol and his factory company is plain, one which also relates Waring and Warhol to the other camp and gay performance groups of the 60s, such as the Playhouse of the Ridiculous or Jack Smith's mouldy extravaganzas, drag shows and underground films. Indeed, Warhol was particularly enthralled by one of Waring's star performers, Freddie Herco, who also danced in a number of pieces and programs with Yvonne Rainer. Herco shared an apartment with Billy Name, who moved into the factory and became Warhol's longest-lasting and most enigmatic associate of the 60s. Warhol made 3 films with Herco and was fascinated by his beauty, his star quality, in quotes, his use of glitzy window display materials, paste jewels, feathers, glass flowers, the whole tawdry fairyland of fake glamour transcended by a spectacular stage presence. For Warhol, looking back on Herco's career after he became a speed freak and in 1964 choreographed his own death and danced out of a window in a sensational camp suicide, the roots of the tragedy were in Herco's lack of confidence, concentration, and above all, discipline. It was a career of unchanneled excess. By contrast, Warhol transposed his own interior discipline into the exterior form of the machine and the factory as the site of automation and of production. But this factory of Warhol's was a minimalist factory that simply recorded rather than transformed its raw materials. The techniques of standardization, repetition, and assembly line throughput were used not to assemble complex finished products, but just literal replicas of what was already there, more or less unaltered. Though art critics and connoisseurs, of course, have often chosen to stress the tiny percentage of personal touch that they are able to trace. Warhol's factory was a travesty of a real factory. Warhol had farmed out work to assistants and friends when he was a commercial artist, holding coloring parties when he produced handmade books and experimenting with handmade printing devices. His assistant, Nathan Gluck, did original drawings for Warhol, which he then corrected, as well as doing the blotting, which was part of Warhol's technique. Warhol's mother was entrusted with doing the lettering. His practice at the factory was simply to update these habits and procedures as new, relatively inexpensive technology became available to him. The silk screen, the Polaroid, the tape recorder, the film camera. All these devices simplified and speeded up the work and removed Warhol himself from arduous involvement. It was much easier that way, as indeed it was for Henry Ford. But Warhol's rationalization of the work process was half serious, half theatrical. In an article on Fordism published recently, Robin Murray describes the impact of Ford's methods and ideas in the Soviet Union. Soviet-type planning is the apogee of Fordism. Soviet industrialization was centered on giant plants, the majority of them based on Western mass production technology. So deep is the idea of scale burnt into Soviet economics that there is a hairdresser's in Moscow with 120 barber's chairs. The focus of Soviet production is on volume, and because of its lack of consumer discipline, it has caricatured certain features of Western mass production, notably a hoarding of stocks and inadequate quality control. These caricature elements of Soviet mass production are precisely the ones that Warhol prized. Volume, 30 Mona Lisas are better than one. Hoarding, he was a compulsive hoarder all his life and of course left enough for an enormous auction at Sotheby's. And deliberately inadequate quality control, leaving errors of alignment uncorrected and so on and so forth. It's easy to imagine the delight Warhol would surely have felt at seeing the 120 barber's chairs. Warhol often reiterated the ideology of Fordism, Americanism, or commonism, as he once called it, in the form which Robin Murray describes. In the welfare state, the idea of the standard product was given a democratic interpretation as the universal service to meet basic needs. Warhol frequently commented on the way in which post-war Fordism produced a form of basic social leveling without, of course, redistributing wealth through standardizing consumption, Campbell's soup, Coke, and so on. But of course, Warhol's own standardized production was precisely on the barbershop scale. Warhol's attitude to the mass consumption commodities whose packaging he replicated is often described as ironic, but I think it might be better understood in terms of theater, of performance, and especially masquerade. Rather than producing images of commodities, he was repackaging packaging as a commodity in itself. In this process, it was the element of display that fascinated Warhol, the transfer to a new display space, the art gallery, of images whose display was already familiar in different spaces, the supermarket, the department store, the newspaper, the fan magazine. It was precisely the proliferation of the spectacle, of the to be looked at, the saturation of everyday life by a new scopic regime that Warhol chose to replicate in a further gesture of theatricality. Warhol was not particularly concerned by the problem potentially posed in terms of loss of originality or authenticity. He was already used to working on assignment in the commercial art world, where he was told what kind of image to produce and then produced it as fast as possible in a given format. He was already used to copying and tracing from photographs, In fact, his first recorded drawing was a childhood copy of Hedy Lamarr in a Maybelline ad. And he was a frequent visitor to the picture collection of the New York Public Library, where he would often come and check out hundreds of pictures as source material. To produce work for gallery spaces, he acquired, instead of an art director, an iconographic programmer, Henry Geldzahler, and simply restructured his system of production. The innovation of Warhol's gesture was that of displaying display. And in a way, there are two modes of display, as I'll go on to argue. First of all, he displayed what was meant to be displayed, commodities, stars, etc. A display in fine art of things that were already displayed in popular forms and media. And secondly, in the films, he displayed what was not meant to be displayed, what was meant to be left in the closet, and which was in some sense taboo, setting up his kind of theatre of male hysterics. In this circuit of display, Warhol's particular position was to be alongside the recording apparatus. Indeed, he seemed both to identify with the apparatus and to perceive it as an extension of himself, a prosthesis, or as he came to call his tape recorder, his wife. At the same time, the apparatus machinized its controller, turning Warhol himself into a phantasmatic machine, in line with his desire. The reason I'm painting this way is because I want to be a machine. Whatever I do and do machine-like is because it's what I want to do. Only if the apparatus was too complicated or tiresome to operate would Warhol let go of it, like the 35mm still camera he gave to Billy Name because there were too many controls to work, and Billy Name used it to document the scene at the factory. Similarly, Warhol hired Gerard Malanga to do the silk screens because it was too much effort to do it all himself. To Geldzahler, these pieces of apparatus were baffles which Warhol needed to function in the interpersonal world. He could only have a conversation over the telephone, and only then if it was being recorded. He took his tape recorder to dinner parties and took Polaroids of the other guests. He often took two tape recorders so that when he was changing the reel, nothing would be lost. He wanted everybody who came to the factory to be filmed in one of an endless series of screen tests. Even later on, through the 70s and 80s, he videoed everyone who came to his offices and had a little video machine on a cart to push around. It's as if by submerging himself into machine-likeness, Warhol could enter in fantasy a world of pure standardization and seriality, in which, at one and the same time, the otherness of the image of the other was effaced and the identity of the self obliterated through the agency of an impersonal, machine-like other with a big O. Thus, imaginary difference was erased and the identity of the subject reduced to the purely symbolic dimension of the name, functioning like a living logo, Andy Warhol, like Coca-Cola or Walt Disney. This idyllic vision of the Andy mat stands in obvious tension with the camp world of caricature and masquerade. Yet the baffle was itself a form of mask, a shield or screen which promised immunity from the exchange of intersubjective looks, while permitting a whole economy of voyeurism and exhibitionism in the form of recorded spectacle. Here, the excess and extravagance of masquerade and display was neutralized by the apparatus, framed, registered, and reprojected on the exterior blank of screen or wall under the supervision of the passive yet sovereign master of ceremonies. At the same time, recording was also a form of storage. Warhol recorded everything endlessly. He ended up becoming a compulsive hoarder of every detail of his daily life. Not only did he have 1,400 hours of taped telephone conversations with Bridget Berlin alone, but he saved records, scraps, and samples of everything that passed through his hands, packing it all up in boxes every month and sending it to storage as time capsules. This mania extended far beyond the bounds of an artistic strategy. It became constitutive of Warhol's being in the world, so to speak. Once again, this accumulative drive was channeled into a serial form, that of the regular scheduled time capsules. Quote, What you should do is get a box for a month and drop everything in it, and at the end of the month lock it up, then date it and send it over to Jersey. This indeed is what Warhol did, and these time capsules, these boxes, all remain for people to sift through, art historians and people. This indeed is what Warhol did: accumulate clutter, as he called it, and then empty it out of his immediate space into his closet in Jersey in an orderly fashion, accumulating an endless series of identical sealed and labeled boxes. In 1970, Andy Warhol was invited to curate an exhibition selected personally from the storage vaults of the Museum of Art at the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence. In his preface to the catalogue, Raid the Icebox, the museum director remarked that there were exasperating moments when we felt that Andy Warhol was exhibiting storage rather than works of art, that a series of labels could mean as much to him as the paintings to which they refer. And perhaps they do, for in his vision all things become part of the whole, a truly Cagean view, and we know that what is being exhibited is Andy Warhol. It's as if the label, Andy Warhol, would signify not a person in the sense of a human subject, but storage, boxes, reels, spools, Polaroids, all labeled Andy Warhol. It would be an immense museum of junk, or rather, since it could all be metamorphosed into commodity form, a department store or gigantic thrift shop. At the root of this attitude, we find once again many affinities with John Cage's aesthetic, the refusal of hierarchy or consequence or narrative. Everything is equally worth recording and storing, and hence all that is needed to record and store it is an automatic process, the simplest possible algorithm. The recording and storing apparatus should not make evaluative distinctions, and to avoid clutter, the single aesthetic imperative, it should adopt a serial procedure of segmentation and ordering based on arbitrary data, the length of a reel of film, or decisions, as for instance for his second exhibition in Los Angeles in 1964, Warhol sent a roll of silk-screened Elvises in a roll with a request to, quote, "cut them any way you think it should be cut. I leave it to you. The only thing I really want is that they should be hung edge to edge densely around the gallery. So long as you can manage that, do the best you can." Later, Warhol became fascinated with television soap operas, a typical example of the kind of segmentation and ordering of the clutter of everyday life, and made a number of sort of experimental pilot soap operas, well, two at least, called Fight and Phony, which were never released and simply sent off to storage. Raid the Icebox records another poignant moment. Back in his office, Robbins, the museum director, informed the curator of the costume collection that Warhol wanted to borrow the entire shoe collection. "Well, you don't want it all," she told Warhol in a somewhat disciplinarian tone, "because there's some duplication." Warhol raised his eyebrows and blinked. In fact, he wanted all the shoes, all the hat boxes without taking the hats out, all the American Indian baskets and ceramics, all the parasols and umbrellas, all the Windsor chairs, and so on. All of them, just like that. This is the same attitude that inspired Warhol's approach to filmmaking. He would shoot a single reel of film for each episode or each movie. He would shoot only one take, and then he would show the movie or the take either as a work in itself, or like Kiss, as a serial. A different Kiss opened every screening at the Filmmakers Co-op for a period of time. Or, as with the longer works such as Chelsea Girls, a series of 10-minute takes would be joined up and shown end to end. There was no editing. Nothing was selected within each take, and since there were no second takes, there was no selection between the takes either. Here, Warhol's approach is completely the opposite to that of William Burroughs, who also tape recorded and photographed everything compulsively, but precisely in order to edit it, to cut the word lines and reorganize the images in complex photo collage. Burroughs' paranoid fear of being taken over by alien words and images, connected obviously with the expansion of the media and the advertising industry, is the exact converse of Warhol's reverse paranoid desire to be taken over. Both recorded compulsively in order to sabotage Burroughs or to facilitate Warhol the workings of the semiotic machine. Warhol's reluctance to edit was a constant in all his activities. Unedited tape transcripts became the basis for his novel, A, and later for his magazine, Interview. With Cage, this refusal of selectivity had both an aesthetic and a spiritual, quasi-religious foundation. But with Warhol, we can sense another dimension, a more social and psychological fear of rejection, which could express itself in the attempt to reintegrate the rejected, not to edit it out. Talking about Freddie Herco and the Factory Company, the San Remo crowd of faggots and amphetamine freaks, Warhol recollected that the people I loved were the ones like Freddie, the leftovers of show business, turned down at auditions all over town. You had to love these people more because they loved themselves less. Warhol surrounded himself with leftovers and set about turning them into stars, not just ordinary people as in the Hollywood myth, but rejects, people turned down at auditions all over town. In Raid the Icebox, Daniel Robbins remarks that Warhol picked an entire row of Windsor chairs, but from an antique connoisseur's point of view, the chairs he chose were of secondary interest. In fact, they'd been kept according to a venerable entry for use in spare parts. Robbins continues, commenting, "What violence the idea of spare parts does to our fanatical notion of uniqueness and the state of an object's preservation. Our present curator will not allow a piece to be exhibited at Pendleton House if all parts are not original to it." Of course, Robbins is right. Warhol's aesthetic does challenge ideas of uniqueness and authenticity. But it's also important to note that the chairs in question were of secondary interest. In fact, they were the leftovers, the understudies, the rejects. Elsewhere, Warhol says, "I always like to work on leftovers, doing the leftover things that were discarded, that everybody knew were no good. When I see an old Esther Williams movie and 100 girls are jumping off their swings, I think of what the auditions must have been like, and about all the takes where maybe one girl didn't have the nerve to jump when she was supposed to. And I think about her left over on the swing, so that the scene was a leftover on the editing room floor, an outtake, and the girl was probably a leftover at that point. She was probably fired. So the whole scene is much funnier than the real scene where everything went right and the girl who didn't jump is the star of the outtake." I don't think there's much doubt that the girl on the swing in the fantasy scenario is Andy, the childhood reject and misfit, beaten up at school, kept in bed with nervous disorders, the girl who didn't have the nerve. The fear is mingled with the anxiety of not being like everybody else, like the 99 other girls on their swings. So on the one hand, we have the deep desire to be exactly like everybody else. I'd quote, "I don't want it to be essentially the same. I want it to be exactly the same." And on the other hand, there is the identification with the rejected. It was the stars of the outtake that Warhol loved, who were meaningful to him. The others, the 99, had no emotional charge. Quote, "I want it to be exactly the same because the more you look at the same exact thing, the more the meaning goes away and the better and emptier you feel." Warhol's fascination with images was bound up with his deep dissatisfaction with his own image, his unattractiveness. He had hair that fell out, blotchy, odd-looking skin, a bulbous nose that reminded people of W.C. Fields. His family called him Andy the Red-Nosed Warholer. He had a nose job and kept out of the sun and acquired a wig. "I really look awful, and I never bother to primp up or try to be appealing because I just don't want anyone to get involved with me." Of course, at the end of his life, just before his death, Warhol had the final triumph of managing to turn himself into a male model for television ads and music videos. Tina Fredericks, his first picture editor at Glamour magazine, comments, "Like the harem guards at ancient courts, he had the power that comes from being totally unthreatening and endearing. The power, that is, which emanates from an imaginary castration. In his novel A, Warhol is called Drella, that is, a mixture of Cinderella and Dracula. The magical transformation from outtake to stardom was achieved for Warhol through voyeurism as a kind of ocular vampirism. The look recorded, appropriated, and reprojected as spectacle the magical transformation of other leftovers into stars. At the same time, it conferred a magical aura on Warhol himself. He acquired not beauty or attractiveness, but glamour and fame. For Warhol, the kind of love that counted was that of the fan for the star, a love that linked private fantasy with public image, a love at a distance, mediated through merchandising, maintained by the obsessive hoarding of fetishes, the process described so well in Edgar Morin's book The Stars that Warhol acquired when it was published by Grove Press in New York in 1960. And as Warhol acquired confidence and assurance, as he began to savor his own success and fame, he turned at first to the stars of the outtake, a process which only ended when he was shot by one of the outtakes in 1968. In 1965, in Paris, Warhol had announced his intention of giving up painting altogether and turning to film. He had started making films the previous year, and on his return to New York, he would soon become involved with the Velvet Underground and the world of music. It's interesting, I think, that Warhol always used this simple, easy-to-use technology. In the field of painting, this was a real breakthrough. Painting, which was a kind of technologically backward handcraft art, which people used a brush and stuff, was transformed by the silk screen, a very simple piece of technology. When he turned to the cinema, which was already highly technologically sophisticated, it was completely the opposite effect. He became a primitive and sort of rediscovered the very first films of Lumiere with a sort of simple, unmoving still camera. The Soviet artists who moved out of painting in the 1920s did so in order to enter the field of commercial and industrial art, advertising, design, and even their own functionalist version of fashion. This, of course, the commercial world of commercial art, advertising, and design, was the world Warhol was coming from. His trajectory was towards performance. In retrospect, it's possible to see telltale signs of the impending move in the artworks themselves. There's a move from the generic products, the 99 girls on the swing, like Campbell's Soup or Coca-Cola, to the stars, Marilyn, Liz, and Jackie, and then to the increasingly frivolous flowers and cows, subjects from Dutch genre painting helpfully suggested by Karp and Geldzahler. At the same time, the gallery space was being theatricalized. The Brillo boxes littered all over the gallery floor, the wraparound Elvis paintings, the cow wallpaper with the inflatable silver balloons. Probably the turning point was 1963, when Warhol first wore his silver-sprayed wig. Warhol was deeply impressed by the scene at his art opening in Philadelphia in 1965, when a crowd of fans screamed at Warhol, Edie Sedgwick, and his entourage. And there was so much of a crowd that they had to remove the paintings from the wall for fear of damaging them. Quote, "It was incredible to think of it happening at an art opening. But then we weren't just at the art exhibit, we were the art exhibit. We were the art incarnate, and the 60s were really about people, not about what they did, the singer, not the song, etc. Nobody had even cared that the paintings were all off the walls. I was really glad I was making movies instead." Warhol, in fact, I think, had a particular fascination with crowds, which obviously relates to the whole interest in fandom and stardom. I mean, he used to go to Coney Island, and then he would, later on in his business art period in the 80s, he'd go to Studio 54, which is a kind of hermetically sealed Coney Island, where you could mingle with a crowd. And I think this kind of crowd mentality. I did an exhibition recently, curated an exhibition of a Mexican printmaker called Posada from the turn of the century, who sold his prints in the street by street vendors. And they were of stars, freaks, criminals, catastrophes, death's heads, calaveras, all the same material which Warhol uses. And I think in relation to kind of factory production and this parody of it and this fascination with crowds, you have to remember that Warhol was only a kind of second generation urbanized figure. His family had moved to Pittsburgh. He was like the first child born at the kind of bottom of the heap in industrial Pittsburgh. His mother still did folk art, you know, all that painting on eggs and so on with repetitive patterns. And there's a sense in which I think Warhol's view of mass production always came from this period of the, you know, the kind of newly proletarianized and newly urbanized and newly Americanized. In one sense, of course, Warhol's films were just another form of wallpaper. Wallpaper that slowly began to move out of silence and stasis into movement and sound, even eventually into color. But in another sense, the films ratified Warhol's need for theatricality. They made possible his plunge into the world of camp, into the underground, the bohemian avant-garde. Warhol traces his interest in film back to the days when he would go to bad movies. And this camp inflection of his taste was strongly reinforced by the films he saw at the co-op screenings organized by Jonas Mekas, especially films from the gay scene, Scorpio Rising, Flaming Creatures, Ron Rice, Jack Smith. This led him on to even worse films like Arthur Lubin's cut-price stagey desert melodrama starring Mario Montez. But Warhol's key decision was to combine the minimalist aesthetic he brought with him, and which was naively present in many bad, cheaply made films. This kind of the cinema of poverty runs through the extremely cheaply made B pictures that Warhol liked and through to his own films. With an equally minimalist refusal to direct. His instructions to his scriptwriter, Ronald Tavel, were that he wanted situation and incident rather than plot or narrative. At first, he wanted Tavel to invent situations and provoke responses from off-screen. In fact, much of the soundtrack came from off-screen comments. Later, he realized that with a cast of confessional exhibitionists, he could dispense with the idea of a writer entirely. Given a forum, they would talk and perform. Moreover, Warhol made it clear that his non-interventionism meant there would be no censorship. Warhol benefited from the freedoms which had been won by others who had to face legal actions. Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs, Jack Smith and Jonas Mekas, Kenneth Anger. The liberties Warhol enjoyed meant that not editing meant not censoring. This was an outcome of the minimalist aesthetic, an unlikely outcome of the minimalist aesthetic, which accommodated Warhol's own voyeurism and love of sexual gossip, and made it possible to combine minimalism with a scabrous sense of the histrionic and the breaking of taboos. Warhol believed so strongly in a certain kind of literalism and non-editing that he was worried when filming Sleep that he was missing moments because of having to change the reel in the camera. To make up for the missing moments, he slowed down the projection speed of the film so that it would be the exact length he felt it should have been without the little gaps. It's exactly this literalism, this insistence on missing nothing, on suppressing nothing, that made the connection between minimalism and outrageous camp performance. Finally, in his last phase of artistic polymorphous perversity, Warhol, switching media and modes, moved out of painting and film and novels, which he'd already tried, into the music world with the exploding plastic inevitable, a mixed media performance environment with movies, light show, expressive dancing, and the Velvet Underground. Warhol recognized in the Velvets a group which already shared the same aesthetic, the combination of minimalism with the outrageous. John Cale had been a student of Cornelius Cardew in England, where he had already absorbed Cage's ideas. In New York, he was close to another minimalist composer, Lamont Young, and played in John Cage's 1963 18-hour performance of Satie's Vexations, a series of 840 repetitions, which was a performance that Warhol actually attended and clearly prefigures his films like Sleep and Empire. At the same time, Lou Reed brought a star presence, a leftover star, as bard of drug-taking and paranoia. Warhol both expanded the theatricality of the Velvets by turning every performance into a mixed media event, Shades of Black Mountain, but also sought to minimalize the performance. Quote, "One of the ideas he came up with, which was very beautiful, was that we should rehearse on stage, because the best music always took place in rehearsals. Similarly, he had irritated Tavel by preventing any rehearsals for his films, so that the only take was in effect of the rehearsal." Warhol was many things. He was the revenge of graphics on fine art. He was the revenge of the swish on the macho. He was the revenge of camp on high seriousness, and the revenge of the underground on the overground. Perhaps one might even say he was the revenge of the ballet russe on the great masculine renunciation. His legacy has passed on to different hands in a number of different directions. The most obvious has been assimilated into the art world and mainstream postmodernism and simulationism. But the potential of the other dimension, the underground, the camp, the velvets, is still available. You can see it very clearly, the influence of Warhol in the music world through Iggy Pop and the New York Dolls on glam rock and punk, through art rock, and thence, to David Bowie, David Byrne, the Sex Pistols, and so on. It left its trace not only on punk, but also on the emergence of militantly gay art, Rosa von Braunheim, Derek Jarman, Fassbinder, Mapplethorpe. In the last analysis, it may be, to borrow Walter Benjamin's categories, that Warhol will be remembered not as the postmodern artist of the copy, but more subversively as the artist of distraction, whose Chelsea girls, like William Burroughs' Wild Boys, rampage through the perverse aesthetic ganglands of the underground imagination. No longer an avant-garde, perhaps, but an art that is fatefully unassimilable. Okay, thank you. I think he was very impressed by David Bailey, the English fashion photographer. And this obviously was at a period when the commercial art world of fashion, which is where Warhol had worked through the 50s, was being transformed in the 60s, mainly coming from England. So-called swinging 60s, and Mary Quant and Bieber and all that. And David Bailey was a sort of new type of fashion photographer. Many similarities with Warhol himself, i.e. he came from a working class background and had become a kind of fashion star through being the photographer rather than through being the model. He's the basis in a way for films like Antonioni's Blow Up and so on. And Warhol came in contact with David Bailey's world. And his first star, Baby Jane Holzer, had previously been discovered and made into a star as a model by David Bailey. And I think that the idea of making stars, firstly, it obviously relates to Warhol's own infatuation with a certain kind of film stars, a certain kind of gay taste and fascination with the image of certain film stars. Hedy Lamarr, Greta Garbo, Liz Taylor, Marilyn Monroe, etc. Ones who in a certain sense can be construed, as Amy Taubin has said, as models for drag performance. On the other hand, he was also fascinated by the changes that were going on in the fashion world, and there I think David Bailey was a key figure for him. Edie Sedgwick, just as a person, was precisely the kind of leftover that I talked about, that he was interested in, I think. But a leftover of, a kind of the poor rich girl type of leftover, rather than the sort of drag queen and leftover, which was the other type. Well, I think, without Chelsea Girls, there wouldn't be any John Waters, I would imagine, I mean, that's precisely that particular kind of scabrous camp begins with Warhol's films. The interesting thing is that Warhol suppressed those films after he was shot and after he went into his business mode. And they were the one aspect of Warhol's work which was never commercial. In fact, he used to subsidize all his 60s filmmaking out of sales of his artworks. It was money down the drain. Very unusual for him because, like many poor kids, you know, he was very determined to, you know, keep the cash flow going and never to be in financial hard times. But he was obviously, you know, I mean, everyone knows there were big changes after he was shot. And I think he tried to suppress this kind of non-commercial aspect which came through in the films more than anywhere else, which has made it much easier, I think, to suppress that whole dimension of Warhol. But it does still show up in films, you know, and I agree. I mean, I mentioned the European filmmakers who immediately come to mind as being influenced by Warhol, but John Waters certainly, you know, wouldn't exist without Chelsea Girls. Yeah, I don't have a lot to say about Waters. Obviously, one of the main aspects and one of the most kind of provocative aspects in Warhol's films was the sadomasochism, particularly in films like Vinyl, you know. And, you know, it's kind of strange to in a way, to think that there's this adulation of Warhol as a mainstream artist going on at one level at the same time as we're, you know, getting the post-Helms kind of stuff in Congress about sadomasochism in art.
Did Andy ever really confide in anybody? Did he ever really open up to anybody?
Well, yeah, but I mean, the diaries are important. I mean, it wasn't just, I mean, first of all, he kept the telephone diary, first really with Bridget Berlin and then with Pat Hackett. You know, then he kept the time capsule type diary, storing, you know, everything which passed, every piece of paper which passed through his hands, and even objects. You know, he would take things from restaurants and store them in the boxes. And then his filmmaking also had a kind of diary function. You know, he would film everybody who came into the factory, and he would film all the time, every day. And he continued that even through the 70s and 80s, only with video, filming people who visited his offices. You know, as they came. So you have this really compulsive, extensive, non-stop, unedited diary activity, you know, and that's where he confided, like everyone else, you know, where he confided was to his diary. His diary is where he was. No, it was just stacked away and stored. When, after his death, when the foundation, I was talking to John Hanhart, who is the curator for film and video at the Whitney, and he sort of went down there and he found a sort of like a TV room just full of cassettes, right? There it was. There was all the diary just in heaps stored, right? A record of what had gone on since they moved into the building. And then all these episodes of soap operas which they'd shot and which never got broadcast. And then all the episodes of Andy, you know, he had a couple of cable shows towards the end, Andy Warhol's 15 Minutes and things like that. You know, it was just all stored and no one knew it was there. The other people working there had never mentioned it, right? They had no concept. And similarly with all the stuff that was auctioned at Sotheby's. Everyone knew he hoarded. They knew he shopped and they knew he hoarded. You know, but they didn't know what there was until it was catalogued by Sotheby's. Yeah. Well, I think there's two aspects to the disaster images. I mean, first of all, obviously, I think they relate to the stars. They come from two kinds of like pulp press, right? One is gossip and fan magazines, which Warhol loved, and the other was kind of National Enquirer type magazines, which they overlap actually in a way, to an extent, in their content. And somebody pointed out that they're the kind of magazines that you would buy in a supermarket, you know? And so I think there's that link there. And I think in a way also that they're a kind of surfacing of this more kind of, you know, the unacceptable, unassimilable side of Warhol, surfacing but within certain limits in the gallery and museum work. The other thing I think relates to what I said earlier about Posada. He obviously was fascinated by death anyway in various ways. I mean, he did a whole series of silk screens even towards the end of his life of death's heads and skulls and so on. His spot, he did a spot for Saturday Night Live, which is the most informative about his views about death, which is all about, you know, his own death. Even before he was shot, I think he had this obsession. And, you know, I would look at them in that kind of way. He associated with people who were bound to die. I mean, I mentioned Freddie Herco's death, and as everyone knows, the people at the factory were people kind of headed straight towards death, many of them. And he was aware of that. I think all the, you know, the thing is that Warhol suppressed those films after he was shot and after he went into his business mode. And they were the one aspect of Warhol's work which was never commercial. In fact, he used to subsidize all his 60s filmmaking out of sales of his artworks. It was money down the drain. Very unusual for him because, like many poor kids, you know, he was very determined to, you know, keep the cash flow going and never to be in financial hard times. But he was obviously, you know, I mean, everyone knows there were big changes after he was shot. And I think he tried to suppress this kind of non-commercial aspect which came through in the films more than anywhere else, which has made it much easier, I think, to suppress that whole dimension of Warhol. But it does still show up in films, you know, and I agree. I mean, I mentioned the European filmmakers who immediately come to mind as being influenced by Warhol, but John Waters certainly, you know, wouldn't exist without Chelsea Girls. Yeah, I don't have a lot to say about Waters. Obviously, one of the main aspects and one of the most kind of provocative aspects in Warhol's films was the sadomasochism, particularly in films like Vinyl, you know. And, you know, it's kind of strange to in a way, to think that there's this adulation of Warhol as a mainstream artist going on at one level at the same time as we're, you know, getting the post-Helms kind of stuff in Congress about sadomasochism in art.
Did Andy ever really buy into anybody? Did he ever really open up into it?
Well, yeah, but I mean, the diaries are important. I mean, it wasn't just, I mean, first of all, he kept the telephone diary, first really with Bridget Berlin and then with Pat Hackett. You know, then he kept the time capsule type diary, storing, you know, everything which passed, every piece of paper which passed through his hands, and even objects. You know, he would take things from restaurants and store them in the boxes. And then his filmmaking also had a kind of diary function. You know, he would film everybody who came into the factory, and he would film all the time, every day. And he continued that even through the 70s and 80s, only with video, filming people who visited his offices. You know, as they came. So you have this really compulsive, extensive, non-stop, unedited diary activity, you know, and that's where he confided, like everyone else, you know, where he confided was to his diary. His diary is where he was. No, it was just stacked away and stored. After his death, when the foundation, I was talking to John Hanhart, who is the curator for film and video at the Whitney, and he sort of went down there and he found a sort of like a TV room just full of cassettes. Right there it was. There was all the diary just in heaps stored. Right. A record of what had gone on since they moved into the building. And then all these episodes of soap operas which they'd shot and which never got broadcast. And then all the episodes of Andy, he had a couple of cable shows towards the end, Andy Warhol's 15 Minutes and things like that. It was just all stored and no one knew it was there. The other people working there had never mentioned it, right? They had no concept. And similarly with all the stuff that was auctioned at Sotheby's. Everyone knew he hoarded. They knew he shopped and they knew he hoarded, but they didn't know what there was until it was catalogued by Sotheby's. Well, I think there's two aspects to the disaster images. I mean, first of all, obviously, I think they relate to the stars. They come from two kinds of like pulp press, right? One is gossip and fan magazines, which Warhol loved, and the other was kind of National Enquirer type magazines, which they overlap actually in a way, to an extent, in their content. And somebody pointed out that they're the kind of magazines that you would buy in a supermarket, and so I think there's that link there. And I think in a way also they're a kind of surfacing of this more kind of, the unacceptable, unassimilable side of Warhol, surfacing but within certain limits in the gallery and museum work. The other thing I think relates to what I said earlier about Posada. He obviously was fascinated by death anyway in various ways. I mean, he did a whole series of silk screens even towards the end of his life of death's heads and skulls and so on. He did a spot for Saturday Night Live, which is the most informative about his views about death. Which is all about, his own death. Even before he was shot, I think he had this obsession. And, I would look at them in that kind of way. He associated with people who were bound to die. I mean, I mentioned Freddie Herco's death, and as everyone knows, the people at the factory were people kind of headed straight towards death, many of them. And he was aware of that. I think all it's sort of part of this whole structure of fascination and obsession. Yeah, I think you're right. He was terrified of death. Yeah, and yet, I think, I don't know. You get into a level of kind of psychoanalytic speculation, but I think you're right. This kind of saving of everything is obviously a way of warding off death. Of making, of freezing time in a certain way. I mean, death is like. The kind of sort of ultimate editing, right? In a certain sense,
Given that the films were the most non-commercial aspect of production and perhaps involved music, why do you think film and perhaps the music happened to be the medium that he chose to be avant-garde in, or to be the man in the underground, as opposed to the other works? And I guess the second part of the question is, are any of the other works could you look at the work's value outside of the idea of quantification?
Which works?
Like everything besides film.
You mean the museum works? Yeah. I mean, I think why he was drawn to film and music is, first of all, they were performance arts, and they were kind of theatrical. He was interested in this whole world of performance and theatricality. I mean, again, the other thing he was drawn to late in his life, and which was there all the time, was fashion shows, right? Which, you know, are in that same kind of, I see the three as going together in his mind: films, music, and fashion, and as performance forms. And then those are also the three forms which were crucial in the kind of whole 60s culture, right? The music, he started out listening to Motown, right? And black American pop music. And then in the 60s he switched with the Beatles and the Stones, and he obviously was fascinated also by the Kinks, as far as I can see. All that sort of rise of a new type of pop music in the 60s. And with films, again, it was like with underground films was where he began, which is a sort of 60s phenomenon. And fashion, I already mentioned David Bailey. I think he was very involved in those sort of changes. As far as, you know, the second part of your question about the museum art and the commodification, I don't think, I think if you look at the museum art just in itself, it just becomes, you know, an art which is about commodification, which becomes commodified, and you get into this hall of mirrors, you know, which is so typical of much postmodern thought. I think, you know, you have to look at I mean, what I've been trying to do in a way is, you know, relate those works to the other works, you know, to sort of break down that barrier between the kind of, you know, vanilla works in the museum and the sort of more disturbing and unpalatable works which were made in the factory at the same time. And they were all made simultaneously in the factory. People were making the nice silk screens of, you know, and also doing the sadomasochistic films. Yeah.
Do you think Andy is more a product or a maker?
Of a what? Of an age. Well, you know, you've got two different time scales, really. He was a product of one age, right? I mean, he was a product of the 50s and 60s, but his influence, obviously, the sense in which he was a maker of an age, comes later, you know, and gets diffused and is out of his control. I mean, I guess I see it some way like that. She was an outtake. I mean, no, she was, strangely enough, she was someone who'd wanted to be in an Andy Warhol film, and he wouldn't have her in. She was precisely the 99th girl on the swing who got fired, not from a real Hollywood film, but from the Andy Warhol film. You know, that's what's so strange, I think, about it. I mean, also she had a kind of, you know, as you probably know, militant political position, and wrote this manifesto of the Society for Cutting Up Men, but which is well worth reading. Actually, it's very lively, and but you know, why she picked on Warhol in particular was because of this, you know, history of her involvement with the factory. She was in one of his films, in fact. No, but there were so many, since they were filming non-stop, I don't know. I don't think it's come to light yet. You'd have to ask John Hanhart, who's been trying to work his way through all of them. But it's a life's work. You know, there's a story by, I think it's J.G. Ballard, maybe it's Philip K. Dick, I could sort of go, I don't remember, about someone, you know, who leaves it, has every minute of their life filmed, and then an eccentric millionaire who has every minute of their life filmed, and then leaves all their money to someone on condition that they spend their whole life watching the film, right? There's, you know, that's the difficulty with being a Warhol scholar.
Whether you
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, in a certain sense, I think you can see him as a victim of his age, and actually as a victim of the 50s, you know, who then, you know, sort of broke out from that in the 60s in a kind of rather classical way. As far as the creating an age, I mean, you've got this contrast between, you know, a completely sort of academic and anodyne exhibition like Signs of the Times, which was on at MoCA here, which obviously derives from Warhol on one level, you know? And then the other things that have come up, like John Waters or Mapplethorpe, which derive from Warhol in a completely different way. You know? It's the second bit I'm thinking of as unassimilable. What I'm trying to say is, you know, you really should take both parts of the package. You know, I don't think people should, you know, the art world, I mean, I think the unconscious strategy of the art world is to, you know, select out. If Warhol stood for anything, you know, it was for not editing, not selecting out, and loving the leftovers. And so I think, you know, the important thing is to put those leftovers, you know, back into the idea of, you know, of who Warhol was and what he did. Sure. When he went into the 70s, like into the business art phase, he surrounded himself with people of right-wing political views. I mean, he went into a complete kind of reverse. The filmmaking was handed over to Paul Morrissey, and he had brought in this new staff for Interview magazine, Hughes and Colasello and people, and got rid of Gerard Malanga and so on and so forth. And, I mean, I think what you got at that stage, I mean, that he became a kind of court painter for sort of international finance and reaction, really. His own politics, as you can tell from reading the diaries, as you would expect a kind of working class kid from an immigrant family in Pittsburgh, were kind of Kennedy Democrat, you know? But he would always kind of, again, you get this in the diaries in which he's sort of always, he goes to these things and then makes bitchy remarks about them afterwards in the diaries. And his basic line is, you know, someone's got to bring home the bacon, which was one of his favorite sayings, you know. And he was became completely financially dependent on this mechanism of Interview and the society portraits and the rich and powerful in his later years. What's strange is that he carried on secretly making, you know, video soap operas like Fight and Phony, which are kind of like continuations of the 60s stuff, but he did it completely secretly. Thank you.
There is a reception in the graduate school annex, which is that away. You go out the door and around by the wood shop. Thank you.